Hello, this is Mr. Baker. We're looking at Unit 10, Evolution, the History of Life on the Planet, and 10.3, Darwin's Theory. We're going to expect you to know all about natural selection and what it means. To do that, we've got to learn about Charles Darwin. Big important fact about him was that he took a voyage on a ship called the HMS Beagle, where he was a naturalist. So he went out and he collected samples of living things and rocks for geology on his 5-year voyage. He read Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which was kind of a landmark piece of science as it gave the age of the Earth in millions of years, not just the couple of thousand, which was the prevailing idea at the time. That would help shape Darwin's thinking. He went to the Galapagos, which are found off the coast of South America, and he said the animals had slightly different varieties from what he saw on the mainland. But they were vastly different environments, but they still looked somewhat alike. How could that be? Why were they so similar? Well, you can see the Galapagos here in the red box in relation to South America. And what actually had happened is that some species had got blown to the Galapagos Island some way, shape, or manner. Perhaps a storm, maybe they rode a raft, who knows, but they got there. And two of the species that captured Darwin's attention were the tortoises and the finches. Tortoises, you can tell what island you're on based on the tortoise in its shell. They're the largest tortoises in the world. And the finches. Finches can be identified because they all had slightly different variations. They looked similar, but really came down to the size of the beak. Some of them had tweezers for picking insects and using tools, and other ones had big, strong beaks for cracking open seeds to get the food inside. There's a picture of your tortoises. Two different species there. You can see the difference in the shell from right behind the head. When Darwin returned after his 5-year journey, he continued to work, and he wrote a treatise on barnacles, and he looked at earthworms. Basically what he was doing was building up a resume that he knew science. He also dabbled in breeding pigeons, which introduced him to artificial selection. He got to pick who survived and reproduced based on whatever traits he saw. So if he liked a pigeon that had a foofy thing on its head, those are the ones he picked to breed, and he didn't let the other ones breed, so their genes, which he didn't like, just didn't show up in more pigeons. Darwin inferred two things. That, hey, if I can pick who chooses and survives, can't Mother Nature? And if you give Mother Nature enough time, could Mother Nature pick the species that we see today? Because Lyell gave him millions of years for this to occur. Add in reading about Thomas Malthus, who worked with human populations, and he said at some point in time, hey, we're going to have way too many people than we have food, and that's going to lead for a struggle for existence. And Darwin applied that to nature, where there often aren't enough resources for every individual egg that survives to grow into adulthood. And those that can survive, he surmised, are more fit, and they will pass those genes on to their offspring, which allowed him to come up with the idea of survival of the fittest, which is essentially natural selection in a nutshell. If you've got the ability and the genes, you will be able to survive, and if you don't, you won't. Make sure that we do understand here that you, me, an individual does not evolve. An individual does not adapt. An individual either survives and reproduces or doesn't. And if you don't survive, your genes end. If you do survive and reproduce, you can pass those genes on. There are 4 principles to natural selection you need to know. Number 1, individuals in a population show variations, meaning that we're all slightly different, and some have things that might help them in the natural world, and others might not. Number 2, that these variations can be inherited. Darwin was kind of guessing here because the idea of a gene had yet to be invented, but he was correct. Number 3, organisms have more offspring than can survive. True. 4, variations that increase reproductive success will have a greater chance of being passed on than those that do not. So if you've got a gene that gives you better eyesight and you're a predator, you might be able to see more prey, you might be able to eat more often, and you have a better chance of surviving and then passing on the genes for better eyesight to your offspring. Well, Darwin spent 20 years, thereabouts, working on his ideas, but he never really proposed them seriously until 1858, where a man by the name of Alfred Wallace independently came up with the idea of natural selection. And I believe the story is he was malaria ridden in a shack in New Guinea, and he was a very good scientist at the time. So he proposed this idea, and Darwin had to also propose his idea at the same time. The reason why you remember Darwin is because Darwin had 20 years of evidence to support his idea of natural selection, and he put all of his notes together and published it the next year. The book is officially titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and it was published in 1859. Evolution shows up on the last page of the term, and is now what we use to define this change in species over time that makes them best fit to survive their environment. With the now understanding of genes, natural selection is not the only way it works. We've got epigenetics and quite other fields, but realize we do want you to know natural selection. So to summarize, your quiz will cover Darwin's theory. You'd better know the beagle, the islands he went to, at least the tortoises and the finches. You should know the difference between artificial and natural selection. You should know Malthus is the one who coined the phrase struggle for existence. And you should know survival of the fittest is the catchphrase for natural selection. And The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Study hard and good luck.